We're going to cover a book by David Eltis. The name of the book is The Rise of African Slavery in the Americas. David Eltis is his research interests are in modern Atlantic world slavery and migration, both coerced and free migration. He is the author of Economic Growth and the Ending of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, which won the British Trevor Rees Memorial Award. And he's the author of, obviously, the book that we're talking about, The Rise of African Slavery in the Americas. And this was awarded the Frederick Douglass History Award. He uses a lot of databases related to the slave trade, the slave ship revolts, English migration, servant transactions, documentation to form this research. And a lot of these databases he actually assisted in developing as far as the slave ship manifestos and the records associated with it. And he obviously took this information and aligned it and made a book out of it. This is a socioeconomic history, and one of the primary points illustrated by Eltis is that Africa functioned in a role of power in Western slavery as opposed to one from being exploited. It kind of jumped off at, that was one of the points that kind of jumped off at me. It's a lot of points of the book. But this particular point about, he is proposing in his thesis that the Atlantic slave trade was a result of a partnership between England, Africa, and the Americas. And, well, not England, but in particular Europe as a whole, as to where these particular groups needed labor. And the labor force was going so good in Europe that they needed the labor there, but they were also expanding in the New World. So that is how the choice of somebody else doing the labor for the other areas actually kind of came up, because his thesis in this book is, how is it colonies or settlements by these imperialistic nations that were supposed to be, United States being an example, established on principles of freedom and equality, how did they function with a foundation of slavery? It seemed that the two would not naturally align. So that's the point of the initial, that's what the entire question is around. But one of the first things he attacks is trying to add credence to his position that Africa functioned from a position of power. Africa was not controlled by Europe. In fact, Europe could not infiltrate the core of Africa. They could stay around the edges, but they couldn't get into Africa because Africa was very developed, had very strong armies. So his point is to show that the depiction of Africa being a heavily exploited by a powerful European force is not necessarily accurate. The problem is that he uses the partnership in slavery to either to imply or lead to the misunderstanding that Africans were equally culpable in the culture of the slave trade. The slave trade was no different than any other slave trade that had happened all over the world. There had been slavery in Africa, there had been slavery in China, there had been slavery in India, there had been slavery everywhere. What was unique about the Atlantic slave trade was the culture of the slave trade and the associated violence, and terror, and torture, and murder. That was exclusively European. And if we go back to the Tannenbaum video, Tannenbaum actually says that that was exclusively Protestant European. Now, it obviously wasn't exclusively Protestant because you had the Haitian Revolution, and that was in the Catholic area. You had many slave revolts. So the point being that Africans did not share in the culture. It was the culture of the Atlantic slave trade that is the issue. It is not slavery in and of itself. It was something that was above it. The dehumanization of a being is what was unique about that. But historians have for decades tried to level the playing field and kind of spread that blame out so the full weight of the Atlantic slave trade is moved off of the Europeans slowly. And I think that partially that's what this book does, either overtly or implicitly. But this is a very well organized book. It every chapter has a theme, has a subject, has a question that it's answering. He first goes into something that I felt something was new to my understanding, was how the Portuguese, the first reason why the Portuguese went down the coast of Africa to get to India. That's so they could always see land. And if they had any problems or bad weather, they could dock, check in, trade, stay out of the storm, get back out there when they needed to. Number two, even though they couldn't penetrate and colonize Africa, they did manipulate Africans as to where Africans were at war with each other. But the Europeans would instigate these issues and bring their technology, which was guns, to assist these civilizations in asserting their dominance. But what they were doing, the European, was keeping up wars so they would have more slaves. So as peace would come in Africa, that wasn't to the benefit of the European. The European needed war to keep going, so they would instigate conflict, so wars would keep going on, so prisoners of war would be taken. They could buy the prisoners of war. Now, the Europeans were capitalists. The Africans were not capitalists. The Africans were spending money for something. I'm spending money to have a bigger, stronger empire. Europeans were buying something that they knew they were going to make more money on. They were buying people that they could sell somewhere else. So it was not capitalism. Spending money is not capitalism. Buying something to make money, making money is capitalism. So in this book, though a lot of the point that he's talking about is about the oxymoron, or how the two things don't jive, how free colonies or colonies allegedly based on freedom, with like the United States, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. How can these types of civilizations exist on the foundation of slavery? That's what the point of the book is. But its pretense is accepting that Africa was an equal partner in the development of Western slavery. And I believe that that's the first thing that needs to be addressed for you to get to the second part. It is a good book to be read. To be agreed with or not, it does add to the historiography that of how slavery began in the beginning, the role of the European instigating and maintaining and perpetuating the conflict in Africa to their personal benefit. It wasn't that the Africans were fighting and they just happened to be the intelligent beneficiaries of this. This was a clandestine plan, just like the Willie Lynch letter, just like every other systematic form of labor, of escapes me, the how black labor has been abused in the Western world and for the Western world. This was an articulated, thought out plan as to how these Africans were made POWs and then sold into slavery. And because of that alone, this adds to the historiography, and it also adds, there are other questions that are asked in this book that are generally not thought of. Why were why were the Africans chosen? And why, if they needed labor, why didn't they enslave each other? Why didn't they enslave the French or the Spanish, who they were always at war with? So a lot of questions, and again, we're keeping the videos down to 12 minutes. A lot of questions in this book, so definitely a read you have to have in your library.